This is a video in a series of videos I'm making for a class I teach at ASU, PHI 328, History of Ancient Philosophy. Here we are at the syllabus. Let's go down to the lecture notes. And we had been talking about Plato here in his theories. And now we are moving on to Aristotle. Now, Aristotle, he was born in a town. He's not Athenian. He was born in Macedonia. And I think I have a map over here. Hopefully this is it. Let's see. Yeah. So he was born up here, Macedon, in ancient Macedon, and in this little town right here. Athens is down here. And so when Aristotle, he came from a prominent family, and when he was a teenager, he made the trip, joined Plato's academy in Athens. So this happened in about 367 BCE, and Aristotle was at 17 or 18 years old, roughly, at that point. And he stayed in Plato's academy as a student until Plato died, which happened in about 347 BCE. And Aristotle himself died about 20 years later, actually 25 years later, in about 322 BCE. Now, if we do a little math, we can see, just to get the timeline straight, we can see that Aristotle, he entered the academy about 20 years after Plato had founded it, and about 30 years after Socrates was executed. And that Aristotle himself, he founded his own school. So after Plato died, a bit after that, he founded his own school, and it's called the Lyceum. It's in Athens. We can take a look at it on a map. So here's ancient Athens. There's the Parthenon would be at the center of the city here. And here is the Lyceum. It was a public gymnasium and park. And Aristotle founded his school there. And Plato, the academy, is over here on the other side. So this is these are city walls. And so they're both outside the city walls, on either side of the city. We have the Lyceum here and Plato's academy here. I guess while we're looking at this, we can see these. This is the ancient port, so commerce would have come in through the port back and forth between these two walls to Athens. And so Aristotle's Lyceum, if we do a little bit more math to get us situated, that would have happened about 250 years after Thales predicted the solar eclipse. Remember that date, roughly 585, is the traditional starting point for ancient Greek philosophy. Okay, let's get out of these maps. Now, Aristotle presents, he's a little bit challenging for us to study for various reasons that I'm about to go through. Let's click on the section for texts. And the one thing we know is that the Aristotelian corpus, what we have, the works that Aristotle wrote that survived, its history after Aristotle's death in 322 is uncertain. And this contrasts with Plato's own library. We think that after Plato died, the books were organized pretty much as we have them now, and that they were what we have now are copies of copies of copies that went all the way back to the manuscripts that Plato authored. For Aristotle, after his death, all his writings, they have an uncertain history. It looks like some of them, the esoteric writings, we'll talk about what that means in a minute, came into the hands of this philosopher named Andronicus um, in the 1st century BCE. So this is a fair amount of time after Aristotle died. And the corpus as we now have it seems to be organized in a way that Andronicus put the works that he came into possession of put together. And in this arrangement, it's not chronological. We think we have a reasonable idea of the chronology for Plato's dialogues. We think we know roughly which dialogues were written before others. We don't have that luxury for Aristotle. What we have is the corpus. Really, we have to rely, well, we have the corpus as is organized, and the organization is systematic. And so what we have is the so-called logical works, followed by the physical works, and the ethical works come last. And because we don't know which works generally were written before others, it's a little harder for us who are outsiders to get inside of Aristotle's thought, although we'll have some success, but it's a challenge for us. Another challenge we have is that Aristotle's writings, because they're esoteric, they are written for insiders, people who sort of already are familiar with what's going on in Aristotle's thinking. And we are not, we are outsiders. So this is going to be a challenge for us because there's not always the kind of explanation that we need to understand what Aristotle is thinking. And as esoteric works, they often, since they don't bother with the explanation that outsiders need, they often take the form of a series of compressed notes. And this is a lot different than what we have with Plato, right? So with Plato, it doesn't look like he expressly wrote those for insiders, right? The early dialogues that we looked at, for example, are modeled on conversations that historical Socrates had, and Socrates, right, didn't talk to insiders, right? There were no insiders. He talked to anyone who'd talked to him. And so this puts us in a better position to try to understand Plato than we are with Aristotle. And another problem we have is with the translations. The translations that we have for Plato, the ones that we've been relying on in the Perseus Digital Library because they're free, they're pretty good. They weren't really a problem. And when certain phrases were a problem, I tried to fix them up. And everything that Plato wrote, we pretty much have in the Perseus Digital Library. This is not going to be true for Aristotle, which presents a problem for us. So if we click on the Perseus Digital Library and go to Aristotle, we can see that we really only have the works that we're going to look at. We really only have the Nicomachean Ethics and the Metaphysics. And we don't have other works that we'd like to see. And we will have to rely on the works in the Loeb Classical Library. Let's see if I can get that to come up. There we go. And they have them. And they are, so if we look, for example, at the Metaphysics, we get both the Greek, and the English translation facing one another. But these translations are the same that we find in the Perseus Digital Library. They're, for the most part, translations have gone out of copyright, so it's easy for us to get access to them. But one difference we have is that the Greek words over here are not linked to a dictionary. Remember that when we were in the personal digital library, if we wanted to see what some word meant, we could click on it and it would bring us to a dictionary. So here we we have this phrase here is all translated over here as all men. Anthropoi, you probably can recognize from how it sounds that it's going to mean human. And we could have clicked on that and gotten to the dictionary entry for it if we wanted, but we're not able to do that with Loeb library. And another thing about the Loeb library is that it's not open source. And if you're not affiliated with an academic institution or otherwise have paid to get access, you can't get here. We at ASU can get here because ASU, as part of the library, pays for our access, but it's not open access for everyone. And this is, I regard this as a problem, but there's nothing I can do about it. Now, Aristotle wrote a lot. If we count up the words in the corpus as we now have it, it's roughly about 1 million words. That's twice as much as Plato. And there's no way we can go through that in the time we have. So we're going to just look at some of the more important works and some of the passages in some of the more important works, which I have listed here to give us an idea of what Aristotle thought. Now, here's supposed to be a painting of Aristotle, and here's Plato. They're disagreeing here about how to proceed in this Renaissance painting. The way we're going to, let's look at, see those words, esoteric and exoteric that I was mentioning, right? So the corpus as we now have it are esoteric. They're for insiders. We click here, we can get to the meaning of the Greek word. There were exoteric works, popular works that Aristotle wrote to attract people to his school, but they haven't survived. We don't have those. All we have is the notes written for people who already sort of know what's going on. So this is going to make our job difficult, but we're going to proceed on a kind of an assumption. We thought when we were looking at Plato that the way we would approach him is think of him as reacting to Socrates. And we're going to make a similar assumption about Plato, about Aristotle rather. We're going to read him thinking that much of what he's doing is reacting to Plato. For all, he was a student in Plato's academy for many, many years. And so that's not too surprising to think that he'd be reacting to Plato and his own philosophy. And we're going to think of him as, our assumption is going to be that in general, he's a Platonist. He's going to accept a lot of what Plato is thinking in its most general form, but he's going to disagree with details in two primary ways. Sometimes he's going to correct what he thinks of as excesses, right? In Plato, right? Plato got sort of the right idea, but didn't, right, kind of stated it in a way that stretches the truth from Aristotle's point of view. So he'll fix those. And then he'll also correct what he thinks of as outright mistakes in Plato. And the other thing we're going to kind of assume, although I think we've established it enough to think that we know it, is that Socrates, the historical figure, right, he was interested in the love of wisdom. We saw that. And it looked like what he thought he needed to know in order to be wise was simply what's good and what's bad. That was really all you needed to know. And that Plato, he gave that a very otherworldly interpretation. That's at least in part why in this Renaissance painting, the painter's having Plato point to the heavens there. He thinks you really need to know more than what's, in order to be wise, the kind of wisdom that the lover of wisdom seeks. you need to know more than what's good and bad. You also need to know, for example, about the forms. And the idea in Plato, we saw in the Phaedo, for example, is that if you practice the love of wisdom while you, as the soul in a body, if you practice it correctly, then when you die, your soul will go on and somehow have the knowledge of forms and of reality that it's seeking while you're alive. And Aristotle will have part of this picture, but he'll correct part of it. So he'll think that with Plato against Socrates, you do need to know something about the nature of reality in order to be wise. It's not simply a matter of knowing what's good and bad, but he's not going to accept this idea that the soul exists apart from the body. He doesn't think that. That doesn't seem to be his view. So he's with Plato against Socrates, but he's against Plato on the soul. This is one of the excess, what he thinks of as the excesses that he's going to correct. Now, because he's with Plato against Socrates about wisdom, he's going to think you need to know something about reality. And the picture of reality that he would have been familiar with is one that we find in Plato's Timaeus. So the Timaeus is a traditionally late dialogue. Remember, we roughly thought of Plato's dialogues as early, middle, and late, and we looked at some early dialogues and some middle dialogues. We didn't look at any late dialogues. The Timaeus is a good example of a late dialogue, and in it, what Plato's doing is describing, having some thoughts about what reality is really like. And he has a character named Timaeus lead the discussion, not Socrates. And I think the reason is, that he realizes that he's going beyond anything the historical Socrates would have thought. Right? The historical Socrates wouldn't have thought that we needed to know any of this stuff to be wise. And so Socrates, he has a kind of cameo role. He shows up in the beginning of the discussion, but he quickly drops out. And the whole thing is led by this guy named Timaeus, who we're told made the nature of the whole, and by this we're referring to the entire universe. He made that his area of interest. He's supposed to know about that. And what he does is give his view about how the cosmos originated, and then he ends with how human beings came into existence. And in this discussion, he thinks that roughly what goes on is he says there's a divine maker, a demiurgos, there's the Greek word, a craftsman, and that the craftsman is confronted with a kind of disorderly existence that he imposes order on, and in a way that makes the cosmos like himself and thereby as good as possible. And he does that. He doesn't have free reign. He has to take into account the existing forms. The forms are part of what he has as what he confronts, right? And that he uses them to give order to the universe, to things, and that constitutes the origin of the cosmos. We have over here, if you like, you can see the words here, for example, he uses to describe that. And so Aristotle probably would have known, actually there's no doubt he would have known the Timaeus as a late dialogue. Looks like it would have been written not too long after Aristotle entered the academy. And we can think of Plato if Aristotle is reacting to it and keeping parts of it and rejecting others. So one part he's going to keep is the teleology, that things are somehow the way they are because that makes them good. And he's also going to keep the forms, but he's going to think that the forms are different. They exist differently in the case of sensible things than Plato thought. And so these two pieces of these two aspects of the picture we get in the Timaeus are ones we're going to try to see how Aristotle corrects. We're going to try to understand Aristotle's view of natural bodies, things like us, for example, in terms of forms. We're going to look at what part he accepts from Plato and what part he rejects. And we're also going to look at what part he accepts in the teleology we have in the Timaeus and what part he rejects. So he is going to say there is no divine maker. He doesn't think there is this demiurgos, right? That's an excess in Plato that he's trying to correct, just like he tries to correct the idea that the soul can exist apart from the body. There is no such creator, but there is teleology. And so we'll try to understand how Aristotle accounts for that. So as we go through, this background picture in the Timaeus seems to be the one that Aristotle is trying to correct. And we're going to first look at how he corrects it with respect to natural bodies.